Thank you so much. Ladies and gents, I promise that, folks, you do not need to stop eating, I promise. But you do need to bring the conversation down because we have a really busy afternoon. I want to just mention, because we have a lot of folks gathered over by the door, can I just see a show of hands of people who have empty seats next to them, if folks by the door want to sit? So there are seats sprinkled around. I also wanted to ask, there's another group of folks I just wanted to recognize in the room. There are a number of folks here who are part of LISC New York City's local advisory committee. If I could just have you guys just stand up and wave. I see Joan Talley, our LAC chair from Morgan Stanley. Who else is in the room? I see Beth Gilroy is here. Greg Schiffelbein is here from Citi. Phyllis Reich from TD Bank. I don't know if I missed any. Pat Swan, of course, our funder for today and also LAC member. I just wanted to mention them because we're actually meeting on Wednesday with and a big part of our agenda is to reflect on today's conversation and think about next steps and think about how it fits into our strategy. So thank you, LAC members, for being here. To kick off our afternoon plenary, I'll be introducing Denise Scott, who's the Executive Vice President of LISC, National LISC. We are thrilled to have Denise here. Denise is steeped in New York City, and she sat in my seat in the LISC New York City Executive Director for 12 years, leaving gigantic shoes for me to fill. And from her perch at National, she now spans all 30 local sites and the rural program, which puts her footprint across 39 states. So she has to balance the needs of a collaborative that spans from New York City to Peoria and everywhere in between. And in July, she joined the board of directors for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So thank you, Denise, and please come up and take the stage.
Good afternoon. It's really good to be here. As Sam said, I don't get to plane traffic as much in New York as I used to, and I kind of do miss it. A little different in Peoria. So today my task is to introduce our keynote speaker, Commissioner Jamie Rubin. We're really happy, all of us here, LISC, the Federal Reserve, and all of our partners have come together to really talk about the issues that have been discussed today. We're at an inflection point in the world of community development, increasingly aware that not everyone is sharing in the benefits of investments that are happening in their neighborhoods. And it's a collective challenge, we think, of public and private sector and all of us to find solutions that will fit the economic issues and help residents really who are being left behind and find a way to prevent those folks from being pushed out of their communities. And at LISC, as Sam sort of hinted to, the challenge is not only a lens that we see through New York, but across the country. So as you heard from the earlier panelists and others this morning, this is a national issue. Without our public partners, like Jamie, we would not have been able to invest over the last year over $1 billion to support housing and businesses and jobs, education, safety, and health in the communities that we work with. And as you know, HCR finances the development and preservation of affordable housing throughout New York State with a broad toolkit that really includes everything from bonds and grants and loans and many more programs. Here in New York, Commissioner Jamie Rubin has been steering the ship at HCR for almost 2 years now, appointed in 2015 to lead the implementation of the $1 billion House New York plan. As head of HCR, he also oversees the rent regulation system, working on behalf of tenants facing landlord harassment and rent overcharges, a very important area in the context of the discussion that we're having today. HCR is making incredible strides helping communities stabilize and grow, creating jobs and expanding housing opportunity by financing and preserving the creation of affordable housing, building permanent homes for the chronically homeless, redeveloping vacant properties, building retail space to anchor main streets, and bringing new life and vitality to neighborhoods across the state. Jamie came to HCR with some pretty impressive street cred, as we say, from the private and public sectors. He cut his teeth early as an investor with several large institutional firms. He was a senior fellow with the Brookings Institute, focused on economic development. He was the New York director of President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Recovery and Rebuilding Task Force, while also serving as senior advisor to then HUD Secretary Sean Donovan. And just prior to joining HCR, he served as the executive director of the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. So without further ado, let's bring to the stage with a resounding noise, like we do in New York, Commissioner Jamie Rubin.
It's awfully hard to think about my background as giving me street cred. Wall Street, oh, good, nice. I don't know who the guy said that. Wall Street cred. It's you know, that's 15 years on Wall Street. It's private plane cred and something else cred, but it's sure it's street cred. Denise, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you, obviously, to LISC, to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, to the Furman Center, to the New York Community Trust, the Charles Revson Foundation, many others for having me here and giving me the opportunity to speak to you. It's been actually, I think, about 15 months since I took this job. And looking around the room as I walked in here, I see there are so many people here from those organizations and so many others who took the time to meet with me right when I started out. And truly, as little as I know now, I truly knew nothing about anything, but more really about any of the subjects I'm going to talk to you about today. And I knew nothing about what my agency does, and you could really ask yourself how they chose me, but that's a whole different set of discussion. But many of you took the time, as much time as I needed, to help educate me about the subject that you know so well. And so in some ways I feel like I've come full circle here, and in a way, I think my job here today is to talk to you about the governor's plans, but really to deliver back to you something that sort of pay you back a little bit and talk to you some about what I've learned in the last 14 or 15 months, and hopefully some of it will be, at least a little bit of it will be, come as new news to you and help you in the work that you do. Excuse me. 9 months ago, Governor Cuomo announced an aggressive 5-year housing plan designed to build or preserve 100,000 homes statewide. This is by far the longest long-term commitment of this kind in the history of New York State, and will involve a substantial new investment in neighborhoods from South Brooklyn to the North Country, which, for those of you like me who grew up in New York City, is part of New York City, part of New York State that's near Canada. It's really near Canada. What I want to do today is put our 5-year plan in the context of neighborhood change and displacement and give you some insight into how one government actor, an important one, takes into account the issues you're discussing here today. Let me start by saying I don't think that anyone questions the need for the governor's commitment. It's clear, as some of your speakers this morning said, that there is an affordable housing crisis. More than 1.5 million New Yorkers pay more than 50% of their income towards housing every year. From 2000 to 2012, the percentage of households with rent above the HUD-defined 30% of household income affordability level increased by more than 10%, resulting in a total of over 3 million New York households paying a third or more of their income in housing costs, and so on and so forth. In essence, a shortage of affordable rental housing taxes low and middle income New Yorkers beyond their ability to bear it. At HCR, my agency, we have a unique perspective on this problem. We regulate and help fund virtually every type of housing in every corner of this incredibly diverse state. So we can see, for example, that in Manhattan, owners of rent-stabilized apartments are pushing them up and out of the system, that Mitchell-Lama rentals in Westchester are going co-op at an alarming rate, and that even the cost to rent space in a southern tier mobile home park can be beyond reach. Across Long Island and in the Hudson Valley, abandoned and decrepit homes are the lasting legacy of the foreclosure crisis, and first-time home buyers in Rochester need some help participating in the American dream themselves. As former executive director of the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, I can tell you that even Mother Nature seems to be part of the problem. Rising seas and the increase in extreme weather threatens hundreds of thousands of homes on our coasts and along the riverbanks. In every respect, what we see at HCR is consistent with national trends. In metropolitan areas around the country, there are stories of low-income tenants being displaced by eager millennials with high-tech jobs and a taste for authenticity. Incomes are up across the country, thank goodness, but Americans necessarily don't feel like their lives, their homes, or their communities are still affordable to them. All of these anecdotes put a human face on the data shared with me most recently by your friend of mine, Ingrid Ellen, showing that in the last decade, low-income urban neighborhoods grew richer and whiter more rapidly than ever. In an inappropriate side note, I will say that one of our presidential candidates explicitly recognizes this pattern and has proposed a set of well-thought-out policies that include expansion of the important tax-driven tools that enable new development and creation of new housing vouchers. The other has said nothing. Regardless of what happens in November, that's the end of my inappropriate commentary. Regardless of what happens in November, the state has to act and act now, which is why the governor made his landmark commitment. The good news is that HCR and its partners in the state's extraordinary community of affordable housing developers are already running at full speed. Since 2011, I'm proud to say that we've financed the creation and preservation of 40,000 affordable units statewide. For the second year in a row, the Housing Finance Agency, another part of our agency, closed out last year as the country's #1 housing bond issuer, with aggregate bond offerings topping $2.7 billion, and I'm pleased to tell you that already 2016 is on target to set new records for us, and we expect the same thing 5 years out. We've financed the rehabilitation of over 5,700 Mitchell-Lama units spread across 22 developments in the last year alone, units that, by the way, will remain affordable thanks to our good work for another 40 years. Last week, the governor did two things that dramatically changed the game yet again. First, he signed a memorandum of understanding defining how $2 billion dedicated to housing would be spent, challenging the legislature to close the deal by doing the same. And he announced the first conditional awards to supportive housing providers to pay for services in the first 1,200 supportive housing units of a 6,000 unit plan covering 5 years. And I'd add that he's a commitment to make to another 15,000 over the following 10 years. Once the Senate and the Assembly decide to act, pause. It'll be the first multi-year comprehensive statewide capital commitment to affordable housing. It will provide nonprofit and for-profit developers with the certainty they need to acquire and develop sites for years to come. It will allow us to target a wide array of needs across the state, and it will be fully funded because the $2 billion has already been appropriated, and the rest of the needed resources are either tax-exempt bonds or other sources largely in the state's control. Again, fully funded. With such a broad mandate and covering such extensive territory, the temptation at our agency could be to allocate capital at several steps removed with an eye toward preserving local autonomy. That is not, however, our approach. Rather, we pride ourselves on understanding local conditions throughout the state and using HCR's arsenal of capital programs accordingly. In other words, while the similarities that I described above are absolutely the case, the situation in Mount Morris, for example, may require different tools than the situation in Mount Vernon. The question is where and how the state should invest and with what impact. Can we increase the stock of affordable housing while retaining the benefits of those investments for the most vulnerable residents in the places we invest? At HCR, we approach these questions with an understanding of the need to deploy capital quickly and efficiently, but an appreciation for the value of restraint and local autonomy. Let me talk some about our plans. The core of the state's housing efforts has long been and will continue to be the financing and development of affordable units. Our agency has a robust set of programs that fund both multifamily and single-family development. These include homebuyer mortgage assistance, low-income housing tax credits, and many subsidy programs, as well as programs that focus on community development, transit-oriented housing, workforce housing, and manufactured housing. So naturally, our immediate focus for the next year will be to devote for the next 5 years, will be to devote up to $1.4 billion of subsidy, remember this is just the subsidy piece of our investment, to support the creation of new units across a spectrum of populations and geographic areas, including significant new investments to create senior housing, middle-income housing, and supportive housing across the state. Let me make 2 important points related to the subject of potential displacement, since that is what we're here to talk about today. First, we are increasing our preservation efforts and not just focusing on new building. The preservation of affordable units already in existence is at the center of every affordable housing plan, as it should be. Preservation is more cost-effective than new construction. It keeps low and moderate income families anchored in a neighborhood by helping people stay in their homes and remain in high and improving opportunity in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. And it is, of course, fundamentally energy efficient and environmentally friendly. The governor's plan, therefore, calls for devoting $560 million of subsidy towards extending the affordability of existing units statewide and creating a large-scale financing program that specifically supports assets, including, importantly, public housing authorities in upstate communities. Additionally, we plan to add $100 million in funding designated for state-approved NYSHCR-related projects. This is in addition to the $100 million in current state funding for NYSHCR. I'll say more about public housing in a moment. I do want to note that one of our most important preservations is a partnership with LISC that targets projects in desperate need of maintenance, and we're now taking, it's called PIP, and we're now taking that model in-house to create a new troubled asset repair program. Learning all the lessons that Denise and I have so painfully talked about in the last several months. So, guys, notice how I sped up when I said that. So an increased emphasis on preservation is our first strategy. A second feature of the governor's housing plan will be the priority we place on housing the most vulnerable, in particular people with low income and those with special needs. The question, affordable for who, has been at the forefront of the debate for several years now. I heard it loud and clear and with some very choice words in multiple languages at a Brooklyn ribbon cutting my 3rd day in office, which was a delightful way to take office. I should say it's worth spending a moment on that experience. It was really fascinating. It was literally my 3rd day in office, and we were in Brooklyn at a public library, and I was with 2 local congressmen. I saw all these nice people with signs, and I thought, oh, great, they're all here to be supportive. You know, it's such a great project. So naive. And they turned the signs around the moment I started speaking and started yelling. And I will say, one of the congressmen gave it right back to them. It was really one of my finest moments in public service. It was absolutely fantastic, and they all disappeared, and I haven't seen them since, unless they're right outside. So, affordable for who? We're answering that question partly by supporting many of our upstate public housing authorities in their efforts to access HUD's incredible rental assistance demonstration program, RAD, which I believe is the last best chance to preserve public housing in this country. We're also proposing to invest more state money in NYSHCR and may have some even more exciting things to say along those lines in the next month or so. There's a growing body of research, some of it by Furman alumnus Sam Bastrop, I believe, that shows clearly that to make this issue still more complex, gentrification benefits the residents of local public housing. So we're using the state capital to build a bulwark against displacement by improving the financial condition of our state public housing authorities and making sure that the folks who live there benefit as the tide around them rises. Along the same lines, we are, of course, demanding of our development partners, private sector and others, that they acknowledge that public capital comes to them as a privilege, not a right, and that they build with deep affordability. Finally, we're scouring the state's cabinets for sites around the state that we can RFP at least partially for new housing development. In all such cases, we expect and demand that bidders will factor low-income rents into their plans, and I mean by low-income, really low-income. Community and neighborhood preservation is a third pillar of our plan. HCR has a range of powers and responsibilities that go far beyond development and preservation. We stand in the middle of the state's efforts to improve communities through thoughtful investments of all kinds. So we're planning to increase the amount of money we spend on downtown improvements and are helping run the governor's ambitious $100 million downtown revitalization initiative. We're working closely with the state's health agencies, DOH and OMH, the Office of Mental Health among them, to put real money behind what we now know about the critical role of housing as a social determinant of health. More about that again in the next couple of months. Interestingly, much of what we're doing is not unique to government. The deployment of state capital and tax-exempt bond financing is critically important, but depends heavily on private partners and serves largely to leverage their activity. There are, however, two areas in which HCR can and does act alone to preserve neighborhoods, two areas in which only we can act. First, HCR, as Denise said, is the chief regulator of the city's rent stabilization code, another fact that somebody forgot to tell me before I took this job. We have some of the strongest tenant protection laws on the books, and we make good use of them as the best defense against unplanned displacement. In New York City, the multifamily real estate market remained strong during the downturn, and it has rebounded with a fury since then. Even the most responsible landlords are necessarily profit-driven, whatever the nature of their investment, affordable by design or not. I believe that people deserve to make a profit, but that does not mean that they can neglect the condition of the property or the health and safety of their tenants. So at my agency, we watch private market transactions carefully as portfolios of rental housing are sold and sold again in neighborhoods where investment has been scant and therefore ripe for redevelopment or, at worst, exploitation. At HCR, we're tracking attempted rent increases, tenant complaints, building conditions. We've seen owners remove heating systems and entire bathrooms in an effort to get rent-stabilized tenants out, and we've pressed cases that have gotten landlords indicted and even sent to jail. Since the governor established the agency's tenant protection unit, we've brought more than 55,000 apartments that should have been registered into the system, and we re-regulate more every day in partnership with the city agencies, HPD and others, and I see Dina Levy, my friend Dina Levy from the Attorney General's office. We all do this work together. In the last year, we've started to examine with a new eye the many unresolved and very complicated open issues of rent stabilization law. And while we absolutely consider each issue on its own merits, I can tell you that my team and I take the firm view that our decisions create a body of precedent, not just a collection of fact-specific outcomes. That means that we read the law with an eye towards its underlying purpose, which is the maintenance of a system that is fair to tenants. Finally, Governor Cuomo has directed us to intervene in the zombie home crisis. On the regulatory front, we will be working with our colleagues at the Department of Financial Services to implement the new laws that aim to prevent default from turning to abandonment and blight. And perhaps most exciting, we're using our funds and the special powers of Sonny Mae, the single-family home mortgage agency, to compete directly with the private sector to buy defaulted loans, which we plan eventually to modify as a way to prevent hard-hit communities from falling still further. As you can see, the governor is driving a very aggressive and ambitious 5-year housing plan, one that aims to solve a housing crisis without tearing apart community fabric and displacing low-income residents from their improving neighborhoods. Unfortunately, government intervention on this scale doesn't happen in a vacuum. In the last couple of years, the economic fortunes of a growing number of New York State's upstate cities in particular have been improving, and even the whisper of new government subsidy can have outsized neighborhood impacts, leading to adverse impacts. This is good, in part. Without constant renewal and investment, our communities stagnate. But government is at its most dangerous when it acts without local knowledge. For that reason, I want to close by talking about the last pillar of our housing plan, HCR's commitment to community engagement. This means far more in this case than simply sending my staff to local meetings, although that is certainly part of what we do. HCR funds an extraordinary network of over 200 local partners to provide technical assistance in areas that lack the deep governmental capacity that we're so lucky to have here in New York City. We depend on them to act as our arms and our legs throughout this enormous state and to help us direct funding to communities that need it the most in ways that will help the people who live here now. And they depend on us to spend the state's money responsibly, saying no to overeager developers who want to overspend with market-distorting consequences. As we move through the early years of the governor's plan, we will be asking for honest feedback from all of these amazing partners and from audiences like the one here today. I thank you for all your help in the past, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you again.